welcome everyone to our Climate Risk Playbook, How to Manage Growing Threats to Your Business webinar. I'm Allison from Sweep, so we'll have an expert panel with us to share their experience and insights into the topics. We have David Carlin, the founder of David Carlin and Company. He created the risk programming for the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, and he has worked as a technical advisor to bodies including the UK's Transition Plan Task Force and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. We also have Julien Denormandie, Sweep's Chief Impact Officer and the former French Minister for Agriculture, someone who's frequently in contact with decision makers at the highest levels in the European Union, as well as major global businesses who work with Sweep, such as L'Oreal. Hello, and thank you both for taking part in this today. We'll get started. We have 20 minutes to take you through some of the key issues around this topic. Then we'll have at least 10 minutes at the end to take questions from the audience. So please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any point. You don't have to wait until the end of the panel, so please feel free to drop those in. Let's maybe go ahead and get started then. Cool. So from the top, David, let's start with first and foremost, what is climate risk?
Well, climate risk really is typically seen in two ways. One, about the ways the physical world is changing and the hazards that creates for people, profit, planet. So that could be storms. We tend to call those extreme events, or it could be rising sea levels. We tend to call those incremental risks. And then on the other side, we know that the only way these challenges will stop getting worse is if we get to a place of net zero carbon emissions. And yet we know that will take a full transformation of the global economy. And because of that, any transformation creates disruption. And so there's a risk in that transition that due to new policies, due to technologies emerging, due to shifts in markets, that companies will face pressure. So really with climate risk, we're talking about both sides. Often climate risk may refer just to the physical, but I think it's helpful to consider it in the broader context, both of how the world is changing, but also how the economy is needing to adapt as well.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's very clear. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on why climate risk should be treated as a core financial risk for businesses today, in addition to an environmental or reputational issue.
I think the evidence for that is just all around us. And one of the wild things everyone keeps talking about, the US is pulling back on climate data, on climate policy, on climate information, and yet half of insured losses due to climate-related events took place in America. So we're talking about real big hits that are affecting the insurance system, the underpinning of the global financial system, that have real impacts on companies because supply chains get disrupted by fires, get disrupted by floods, get disrupted even by people moving and migrating. And so what becomes, I think, really clear is that these risks are a lot more immediate. I think in the past, we've made this mistake of talking about climate as future risks. And you hear that a lot of the future generation and what we would need to do for our children and to protect the planet. But I'm here to tell you that these are challenges people are facing every day. We're talking about supply chains that are being disrupted by low levels of water. So drought, that has caused curtailments in France's nuclear fleet, for an example. On the other side of the world, we've had storms, but also droughts in Taiwan, and that's affected the global semiconductor business. And so I think a lot of times people get very narrowly focused. Oh, well, I'm not buying coastal real estate, or I'm not a subsistence farmer. It's not going to be something that affects me. And I think from the spread of diseases to global conflict to the disruption on supply chains, both on the physical and the transition side, you should really see that the growth of renewables as a displacer of a lot of legacy fossil infrastructure. There's a lot of volatility and noise out there, and it's now. It's not 5 years from now, not 20 years from now, not 2050. But I think that to me is why this has the immediacy it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, David. Yeah, moving over to you, Julien. So many companies struggle to identify where climate risk actually sits in their operations and value chains. What practical steps can executives take to map and assess these risks effectively?
Thank you very much, Alison. I think definitely it's a very important question. And as David said, climate risk is not on a long-term period now. It's something that you have to include in your day-to-day business. And to do so, you have first to set up the perimeter of the climate risk, both physical risk or transition risk. And this perimeter today includes your supply chain. And this is the most important point, how you are able to assess the climate risk all among your supply chain, how you are able to map your suppliers. And most of the time, the climate risk impact will come from your own supply chain, with the examples given by David a few minutes ago. So you need to map your supply chain, but you know that only a data approach can allow you to have this mapping. At Sweep, we are a ESG data management platform. We are able to map your own supply chain. We are able to get some granular data from all your suppliers. So we're able to get a picture about the sustainability of your suppliers. And we know that this is a very comprehensive exercise. It means that you need to collect a bunch of data, and it could be a little bit difficult or complex. Let's be realistic. And one advice probably is to assess the maturity of your suppliers, because you've got a direct link between the maturity in terms of sustainability of your supplier and the maturity in terms of risk management of your suppliers. The day when you have a suppliers with a very proper and relevant carbon footprint, for instance, then you can be sure that this supplier probably they take care of the climate risk in parallel. So my advice could be to say, okay, map your supply chain, but when you are going to do the mapping of your supply chain, the first question or the first step is to map the carbon emission of your supply chain and to map the maturity of all of your supplier, of any of your supplier. And then you could have a clear picture about whether or not your supply chain could be sustainable.
Yeah, very clear. Yeah. Thank you so much, Julien. So David, I'm going to come back to you now. Regulations around climate disclosure are accelerating globally. What do you see as the biggest challenges for companies trying to stay ahead of these requirements, especially in the US and in the UK?
Yeah, well, I think the US and the UK are very, very diverse markets at present. And that actually is probably the first of the challenges, which is so many organizations that I work with and talk to, and I know that Sweep has been working with, really do have operations in multiple places. And because they have those operations across the world, it isn't simply put that, oh, well, we can do one thing here and that's going to be good everywhere. In some cases, we've seen almost the contradiction of here we're required in the UK to look at certain factors. In the US, we're potentially penalized or at least persecuted if we do. And yet at the same time, risks are still present, as I started off my remarks, in America. And so I think the big two challenges, one is that one on fragmentation. And I think that's the irony of these kind of quote unquote business friendly policies are not actually so friendly when they create the need to have to change what you're doing depending on where you're at. I think the second part, though, is the actual implementation into strategy. And for example, the Bank of England, but also European Central Bank, has really made this point for years that the actual practices on things like climate risk management are really not super well aligned to what needs to happen. So sure, we have more reports. Sure, we've done more exams and assessments, but no, we really haven't done those things that are necessary when it comes to embedding this in our credit processes, embedding it in our operational risks, embedding it in the decisions that we take. And I think without that decision-based integration, to me, that's a gap that I see on both sides of the Atlantic, despite the fact that there's some really good analysis being done, even from US institutions. But that integration, which relies on incentives, it relies on data, it relies on leadership, those are the places where I think we're not quite seeing enough of that.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you so much, David. Julien, I'm going to pull you in here. Your perspective as a former French government minister, what are the biggest challenges you see for companies when it comes to shifting regulations?
The point is, when you are speaking about regulation, you have different regulation, as David said. Speaking about the US and UK regulation, to be honest, they don't take care of climate risk. You do not have a part of the US or UK regulation dealing with the climate risk. You do not have any mandatory requirements regarding your own climate risk all among your supply chain, for instance. This is different in the EU because in the EU, the new upcoming regulation, the so-called CSRD regulation, will have risk and climate risk management dedicated part, meaning that any EU company, they will have to assess their own climate risk and then to have some transition plan to address the climate risk. So here you have a difference between the different regulations, and you have to keep in mind that if you are a US companies, for instance, and you are working with the EU, because, for instance, you are exporting to the EU area, then the EU regulation will apply for you. And you will have to report under this EU regulation in 2029 based on 2028 data. And this is a topic SWIP can help you if you want. We are able to manage with this kind of regulation. But what is very important is to say, okay, at the time being, only the EU regulation take care of the climate risk. Probably other regulation will do exactly the same move in the coming years, just because climate risks are becoming more and more important, as David said. But in parallel, only one advice: don't wait for the regulation before making your changes. The regulation is only to put pressure at the end of the day when the market is not evolving enough. But why waiting for the regulation, whereas you know that acting to address your climate risk today is absolutely essential, because it's not, once again, a long-term issue, it's a present issue to address your climate risk and your risk assessment. So once again, don't wait for the regulation, start to map your supply chain, start by mapping the carbon emission all along your supply chain, and then having a kind of mapping of the maturity of your different suppliers, and then make an evolution regarding your procurement to be sure that at the end of the day, you will never be dependent on companies which are not sustainable on a long-term period. This is the main risk. And we need to address this risk. And probably this is the best way to accelerate the fight against the climate change by promoting the sustainable company all among your supply chain.
Yeah, great response, Julien. So it sounds like we really all need to be forward thinking here and thinking ahead and not waiting for this regulation. Very well put. Thank you. David, I'm coming back to you again. Do you see companies integrating financial and climate risk management into their planning, or is it still seen as a side issue?
I would say we're beginning to see companies doing this, and I think it's definitely what I would consider good practice amongst the organizations that I've seen, the integration into policies, into incentives, into roles. I would say that is still the minority. Most firms will discuss this, and I think that that's one of the ironies. You look at a lot of reports and you say, yeah, that report is a good report, but to be honest, it's actually really not super well focused on how it ties back to what the people in that organization do and need to do. And I think that's one of the places where we really need to see more integration going on. Firms that are doing this well are ensuring that they have the teams, that they have the knowledge, that they have the tools in-house that will enable useful decision-making. Otherwise, it's a little bit like flying blind, saying, oh, well, we want to get there, but we don't have a map and we don't necessarily know how to drive. And I think part of this is why, as I said, those skills and tools become so essential. And certainly it's good practice, and we've seen the firms that see it as good practice really investing in those things and recognizing that it isn't just a one-off process, but a much more enduring one.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. So, Julian, we can assume that the people who joined us for this webinar today already see climate risk as an important issue for their company. So, from your experience with companies that Sweep works with, can you give them some advice on getting buy-in from key stakeholders within their business?
Yeah, very important point. Once again, I will second what David said in the previous answer. I think speaking about the way to manage climate risk is probably a matter of process. You need to have the proper tool. Sweep can be one of them. You need to map. You need to accept a data approach, because speaking about risk management means exactly the same for financial risk, means that you need to know exactly what is happening in every part of your core business. And only a data approach allows you to do so. So you need to accept this data approach, and you need to implement this new process. Exactly as we have performance process, financial process, auditability process, we need to accept to have a risk management process, climate risk management process within the companies, and involving all the different departments of the companies, from the risk department to the procurement department. Having said that, the second part of your question, Alison, is to say, okay, let's do it, but how to convince the C-level of my company regarding the importance to have this risk management approach? First, this is an evidence, and more CEO are convinced by this evidence that you need to take care of this climate risk management, just because it's a question of sustainability of your own company. Second, we need to assess the return on investment regarding the risk management. And the return on investment could be very interesting, because you can speak about avoided cost. Let's imagine among your value chain, suddenly you have one of your suppliers not sustainable, he disappears, he collapses. What could happen on your value chain? It could be a disaster for your own core business. So addressing the climate risk management is a way to avoid future cost. Okay, first point, first example. But second example, I think much more interesting is to say most of the time, when you are speaking about a risk, you've got an opportunity behind the risk. And just one example, I did mention the EU regulation, CSRD. You know, in the EU regulation, the risk assessment part is called IRO, Impact, Risk, Opportunity. And risk and opportunity are totally linked, totally dependent on each other. Why? Just because most of the time, behind a risk, you've got an opportunity. If you are able to address the risk on your market, probably you could have an opportunity, an advantage compared to your competitor on the same markets. So the question is how you are able to transform the risk, to address the risk, to assess the impact, but to address the risk and to have a kind of reverse mechanism to make this risk as an opportunity at the end of the day, because on your market, you will be the one addressing the risk. I don't know if it's clear, but I am totally convinced of this approach. Impact, risk, and opportunity. I think this is a good way to convince your C-level in your company.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian. Very clear. I think I've got one more question for David, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A from everyone who's participating and joining in on the webinar. So David, finally, if you were advising a sustainability executive at a large enterprise today, what's one thing they should prioritize in the next 6 months to reduce their climate risk exposure?
So I think this is a really critical time to start asking the right questions about your supply chain, start asking the right questions about where your dependencies are. I see way too many organizations that are very much of the well, once something happens, then I'll know. And this is actually a great time if you want to reduce your risk, understand where your vulnerabilities are. And you may have some big benefits from that. You may find actually you're paying for insurance that's not covering you for the risks that you have. You may be paying too much. You may be working with supply chains that are not resilient. All of these are absolute possibilities, and I think firms need to really appreciate that and to reckon with it as well. So those are some of the big things that I think are critical for folks to be doing. But starting with those questions, asking those questions, I think is something that can be done imminently. The other part is beginning to develop a resiliency plan, asking the question, if there's a risk that's uncovered and a risk materializes, what are you going to do about it? A lot of business continuity is having a plan. Think of, in the electricity side, this is your backup generator. This is your way of keeping the lights on when things aren't going well. How many organizations really have that plan? And I think the short answer is not enough.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Thank you so much, David. Thank you both, Julian and David, for giving such insightful answers to all of these questions. Really learning a lot from you guys both here, addressing your supply chain, not waiting on regulation. With change or risk comes opportunity, and really just starting now is what I'm hearing as the overall takeaway. So with that, I want to now turn to any questions that the audience might have, or anything that anyone may have wondered throughout the webinar so far. Okay, so we do have a question from Cyril. Do you think AI can help reduce climate risk, and to what extent? David, Julian, I don't know if one or the other of you wants to take this one.
I think there's a number of ways where we can see AI playing a positive role. A lot of people talk about the energy side, and that's understandable. But I think there's a number of really positive roles that fit in, and a number of those really connect into one, optimization. So are there systems that can be made more resilient? So a good example, when it comes to renewable energy is we know when there are particularly strong storms, you don't want wind turbines turning in those that can damage the equipment. In cases, where there's hail, you may want to protect solar panels. In cases where you are awaiting a significant storm surge, well, then thinking about what does that mean for public transit? So AI can be both an early warning system and an optimizer. I think the second is on the data side, it can very quickly identify areas of potential vulnerability and make better guesses. I think it's not always that AI will know, but it's about we have opacity. We know this. We have this opacity in our supply chains. How do we begin to bring some of those things to light? And how do we make a best guess using all of the other estimates, whether it's emissions footprint or whether it's exposure, to say, I don't know that facility, but I do know of all facilities that kind of look like this tends to be the exposure, or this tends to be the carbon footprint, or however. So I think those are places. And then finally, I think on the synthesis of information, there's so much information coming in. What are the pieces that matter? And how do you really get that into a form for executives to read, to feel briefed, to feel ready? And I think those are places, absolutely where AI can serve a worthwhile role.
Yeah. Yeah, not only a changing landscape in the environmental and the climate field, but also within the technology. So using those with each other, I think will benefit us in the long term. So thank you, David, for that answer. I've got another one for you here. How do you advise companies that operate across multiple geographies with different rules? I know we've talked about this a little bit already with the EU regulation versus the UK and the US. So what might you say here, David, is the smartest way to stay ahead when we have businesses operating across these different geographies?
Yeah, I would say for businesses across different geographies, there's really three tips that I give, and ones that I work very closely with leaders on. The first is understanding where you are exposed. So knowing, okay, well, I'm not domiciled in the EU, but I will be covered by this extraterritoriality, or indirectly, I will be covered because my supplier is, so they're going to ask for this. So I think that mapping is a critical first step. The second is understanding where regulations are going to conflict and how they're going to relate to each other. A lot of times people have said, oh, well, single or double materiality, it's one or the other. But the truth of it is double materiality includes single materiality. The truth of it is single materiality considers financial impacts from reputational risk. So a lot of times knowing what the particulars are and what they actually mean in terms of how they relate to each other is important. And then lastly, there's a really important suite of no regret actions, preparations, getting data feeds, getting information that are all going to be there and are going to still be there regardless of which jurisdiction you're operating in, whether regulation ebbs and flows. And it's those kinds that I think really, really urgently need a high degree of action right now, because even as pieces are coming into place, you're still going to need to look at different scenarios. You're still going to need to be accountable to your stakeholders. You're still going to need to measure and manage some of the challenges that are coming in the near term and beyond. So given that you have to do that stuff, like to me, it's a little bit regulation agnostic. And sometimes people say, well, we're going to wait until this comes out. But we have the outlines, we have the information. So to me, it's that last one of don't wait.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. Thanks for answering that one. I think I'm going to turn to one last question, and then we'll close out the webinar series. So, Julien, potentially for you here, do you think that companies that act early on climate risk will actually see a competitive advantage? And if so, how and maybe why?
I mean, this is not a gut feeling. This is, we've got so many pieces of evidence about the fact that any companies taking care of the climate risk, probably they've got an advantage on the market. And one example, very clear example, is when you have a look at the different RFP, requests for proposal, Today, big accounts, they're asking for more and more sustainable suppliers. And when they are assessing the sustainability of their own suppliers, they are first assessing the carbon footprint of the suppliers. They are assessing more and more the water management, the water impact, the waste impact of the suppliers. And then more and more they are assessing the risk linked to the suppliers and the impact of the climate change on their own suppliers. When David did mention the double materiality, the famous double materiality, it means that you have the financial materiality and the impact materiality, and both materiality more and more are taken into account by the big accounts, so enterprises, large companies, or financial institutions when they are looking for any new suppliers or for their current suppliers. So definitely in terms of market share, for sure, the more you address your climate risk, the better it is to get some additional market. This is one point. And a second point maybe is today, in the current context, with a lot of uncertainties, when you want to raise additional money, to raise capital, and blah, 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 and when you have some discussion with investors, for sure, if you cannot give your investors some piece of evidence regarding your sustainability on a long-term period, you are not able to raise any money, not able at all. So for those two reasons, market share or when you need to raise additional money, for sure, it's a huge advantage to be able to give some piece of evidence of the fact that you are addressing the climate risk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julien. That's all we're going to have time for today. So thank you to everyone who's joined us, and to David and Julien for your expertise. If there's any questions that we didn't have time for, we'll answer them in a follow-up email. But thank you again, and I hope to see you guys soon for another Sweep webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is great. Really fun to join you.
Agreed. Thank you guys so much.